Imagine an organization operating deep inside a powerful military. It's part law enforcement, part shadowy secret police.
Yeah, and its influence wasn't just on soldiers. It stretched right out into civilian life.
Doing everything from, keeping order to ruthlessly crushing any dissent.
That's the one.
Today, we're taking a deep dive into the Kempeitai, the military police of the Imperial Japanese Army.
And our sources today really lay out the whole story, where they came from, how they grew, what they actually did.
And crucially, the impact they had, especially during World War II. It's quite a story.
It really is.
So our mission here is to unpack this multifaceted nature of the Kempeitai. How did it go from its initial purpose to become, well, so infamous?
Okay, let's get into it. Where do we start? Origins, right?
Yeah, let's kick things off there. When did they first appear?
So the Kempeitai were officially founded in 1881. This is right in the middle of the Meiji era.
Okay, so Japan's big push towards modernization, westernization, that whole period.
Exactly. And they didn't just invent it out of thin air. They looked west, specifically to France.
Right.
Yeah, they modeled it directly on the French National Gendarmerie.
Huh. Why the gendarmerie?
Well, think about it. A centralized military police force. It probably really appealed to the Meiji government trying to consolidate power, keep control, especially within the new conscript army.
Right, so it signals that early emphasis on military authority kind of spilling over.
Pretty much. It wasn't some ancient samurai tradition. It was a modern, Western-inspired creation.
And they started small, right? I remember reading that.
Oh, tiny. Initially, just 349 men. Very elite, but small numbers.
349, wow. Given what they became. That's surprising.
It really is. And their first job was quite specific, too.
Which was?
Basically enforcing the new army conscription laws, making sure the draft worked, that the personnel side of this new modern army was, well, managed.
Okay, so starting focused. Managing manpower. A huge leap from that to the kind of power they wielded later. How did that happen? How did the role broaden?
Well, it's completely tied up with the rise of Japanese militarism. As Japan's ambitions grew, as the military expanded its reach.
So did the Kempeitai.
Exactly. Their size, their duties, everything scaled up. And there were key laws that sort of formalized this growth.
Laws.
Yeah, passed in 1898 and then again in 1928. These laws define the structure, essentially creating two main parts.
Okay, what were they?
First was the General Affairs section. Think of this as the internal management and political arm.
So handling policy, personnel, discipline.
Right. Records, and importantly, political policing, making sure everyone in the Army, and even the Navy to some extent, towed the line.
Political policing. Okay, that definitely points towards a wider brief than just catching soldiers breaking rules.
Absolutely.
And the other section?
That was the service section, more logistical, maybe. Supply, organization, training, but also public security, and crucially, counterintelligence.
Counterintelligence, that's a big one.
Huge. And it's worth mentioning, the Navy got a bit nervous about the Army's growing power, including the Kempeitai.
Oh, yeah. So they set up their own military police, the Tokeitai, probably to try and limit the Army's influence a bit.
Interesting. A bit of internal rivalry there. So by the early 20th century, we've got this formal structure, these two sections. What were they actually doing day to day?
Their responsibilities were, well, broad. Very broad. Inside the Army, yes, they were the military police, maintaining discipline, investigating soldiers' crimes.
Standard MP stuff.
Standard MP stuff, plus enforcing conscription, guarding important military areas. But they went way beyond that.
How so?
They also functioned as a civilian secret police force. That's where the clandestine, the covert operations come in.
Right, you mentioned counterintelligence. What else falls under clandestine?
Things like counterinsurgency, running human intelligence networks, gathering info from people on the ground.
Okay.
They did interrogations not just of soldiers, but anyone suspected of spying or resisting Japanese rule.
So civilians too, definitely. And they ran security at POW camps, conducted raids to capture people, secured key buildings, both in Japan and, increasingly, in the territories they occupied.
It sounds like they had their fingers in a lot of pies. Almost like a shadow government in some ways.
In some ways, yeah. Their reach was extensive, covering control, information, security.
And this power, this reach, it just intensified as Japan started occupying other countries, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. That's where you really see their role explode.
Let's talk about that. How did things change on the ground in occupied territories?
Their job list just got longer and longer. Suddenly, they're issuing travel permits for civilians, recruiting local labor, often forced labor,
Right.
arresting anyone suspected of resistance, requisitioning food and supplies, spreading pro-Japanese propaganda
And I assume suppressing any opposition.
ruthlessly. Any hint of anti-Japanese feeling was stamped out. Their presence was the occupation for many people.
Let's zoom in on a couple of places. Korea, or Chosin, as Japan called it. That was a major area for them, wasn't it?
A huge one. In Korea, the Kempeitai actually evolved into something slightly different, the Kempei-kazatsu, kind of a gendarmerie specific to Korea.
Right.
They set up police stations all over, and this is key. They recruited a lot of Koreans into their lower ranks.
Using locals to control locals.
Exactly. A classic tactic. Gave them eyes and ears within the population.
And what was their impact in Korea specifically? What were they focused on?
Well, suppression was job one. Any Korean political activity, any expression of Korean identity that wasn't approved, they shut it down.
And the darker stuff.
Tragically, yes. They were central to rounding up comfort women for the army, and they conscripted Koreans to be guards in POW camps, often treating Allied prisoners brutally.
Horrific.
Beyond that, they were enforcing all those policies aimed at erasing Korean culture, the language, the customs, pushing Japanese organizations, Japanese propaganda through newspapers, radio. It was total cultural suppression, hand in hand with political control.
A really grim picture of colonial enforcement. What about Manchuria? Manchukuo, another key zone.
Yes, definitely. Manchuria was a massive operational base for the Kempeitai. Huge presence there.
And significant for careers, too, I read.
Very significant. This is where it gets quite chilling, actually. Several men who became major figures in wartime Japan, infamous figures, cut their teeth in the Manchurian Kempeitai.
Really? Like who?
Well, people like Toranosuke Hashimoto, who ran the show in Manchukuo and later became vice minister of war, Shizuichi Tanaka, head of the Kwantung Army Kempeitai, then later commanded forces in Tokyo,
Okay.
and the biggest name, of course, Hideki Tojo.
Tojo. He was Kempeitai.
He commanded the Kwantung Army Kempeitai before he climbed the ladder to Minister of War, Prime Minister. His experience in Manchuria, overseeing that brutal control, undoubtedly shaped his whole approach.
Wow, that really connects the dots. Believing in ruthless efficiency, absolute authority, learned on the ground in Manchuria.
You have to assume it played a major role, yes.
Yeah.
Seeing how the Kempeitai could exert control.
Their reach went even further south, right?
Yeah.
In Southeast Asia.
Correct. As the empire expanded, so did the Kempeitai network. And again, they relied heavily on recruiting locals.
Auxiliaries.
Yes. Taiwanese, Koreans again, people from French Indochina, Malays, others, mostly used for guard duty at POW camps, local policing tasks.
Leveraging the local population again?
Standard practice for them.
Huh.
In French Indochina, they even specifically recruited from the Cao Dai religious group.
Okay, so this massive expansion, this deep involvement in occupation,
Yeah.
it leads us inevitably to the question of brutality. They became notorious for it.
Notorious is putting it mildly. Their reputation for extreme brutality, for crushing dissent with utter ruthlessness, was well earned, unfortunately.
Torture.
Yeah.
It wasn't just rogue agents, was it?
No, sadly not. Torture was systematic, it was widespread, and perhaps most disturbingly, the methods were actually taught in Kempeitai training schools.
Taught as part of the curriculum.
Yes, which tells you a lot about institutional acceptance, the normalization of these horrific practices.
What kind of methods are we talking about?
It's a truly grim list. Flogging, waterboarding, the water cure, they called it, sometimes burning, electric shocks,
Okay.
separating knee joints, suspending people, making them kneel on sharp objects, pulling out fingernails and toenails, breaking fingers. It was methodical and designed to inflict maximum pain and break people.
Unbelievable. Just hearing the list. And it wasn't just torture in secret prisons, right? There was public violence, too.
Oh, yes. Summary executions were common. Violent reprisals against entire civilian communities happened frequently.
Collective punishment.
Exactly. And then there's their deep involvement in procuring comfort women, which we mentioned, and also providing human test subjects for Unit 731.
Unit 731, the biological warfare unit.
Yes. The Kempeitai rounded up people, prisoners, resistance fighters, sometimes just unlucky civilians, codenamed them maruta, meaning logs.
Logs.
Logs of wood, dehumanizing them completely, and shipped them off to Unit 731 for horrific experiments.
This connection just cements their dark legacy, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It ties them directly to some of the worst atrocities of the war.
Now, how did they fit in with other Japanese organizations? Were they operating alone, or part of a wider net?
Definitely part of a wider net. They worked alongside the civilian secret police, the special hire police.
Kokori.
Yeah.
How did they interact?
Sometimes they ran joint operations. Both acted as secret police, but also as public censors, keeping an eye on private morals and dangerous thoughts. It was a pervasive system of surveillance.
So military and civilian police working together to control the population.
Pretty much. Multiple agencies, all focused on control.
And if you fell into their hands, what was the process like?
The attitude was basically, you're guilty until proven innocent. Or rather, you're presumed guilty upon arrest.
Right.
Examinations were secret. Torture to get confessions was, as we've said, standard practice. Legal rights like habeas corpus, often just ignored.
A complete disregard for due process.
Totally. And they also worked closely with military intelligence, the Tokumu-Kikan.
Okay, what did that involve?
Joint operations again, espionage, counterinsurgency, counterintelligence, running propaganda campaigns. It was all about strengthening the state's security and intelligence grip.
And it seems like their power just kept growing, especially later in the 1930s.
It did, particularly after Tojo became Vice Minister of War in 1938, and then an Anti-Espionage Act in 1939 gave them even more authority.
So they became more visible, more active.
Definitely. Their power became even more entrenched, both in Japan and across the empire.
Let's talk about some specific incidents. Big cases or events that really show the Kempeitai in action. The Richard Sorge spy ring, they were involved in that, weren't they?
Yes, the Sorge ring is a famous one, a Soviet spy network operating right under their noses in Tokyo, gathering vital intelligence.
How did the Kempeitai handle it?
Interestingly, both they and the Toka suspected something was up, but they didn't share information well initially. It was actually the Germans, Sorge's supposed allies, who tipped off the Kempeitai.
Huh. Interagency rivalry again? Maybe.
Seems likely. Eventually, though, they did roll up the network. Sorge and his key Japanese contact, Ozaki Hatsumi, were arrested, interrogated.
Tortured, presumably.
Almost certainly, and then executed.
Okay, what about Allied personnel? The Doolittle Raiders, for example. The U.S. airmen captured after the Tokyo raid.
Ah, yes. Their treatment was exceptionally harsh. Because they were caught in China, often in civilian clothes, the Japanese deemed them unlawful combatants.
Meaning no POW protection.
Exactly. The Kempeitai subjected them to brutal interrogation, including waterboarding. 3 were executed after a show trial. Others faced mock executions purely for psychological torment before getting life sentences.
Just brutal.
And that harshness towards captured airmen only got worse as the war went on. By 1945, formal trials were often skipped. Execution, often beheading, happened quickly after capture.
There were specific horrific examples too, weren't there? Burning alive, things like that.
Yes, absolutely horrific incidents. Airmen burned alive in Hangzhou, beheadings in Burma, killed with lethal injections in Saigon, even some killed by the blast during the Hiroshima bombing because they were held nearby. It underscores a total descent into ruthlessness.
And this brutality wasn't just reserved for captured enemies. We touched on reprisals against civilians.
Yes, widespread and devastating. After the Doolittle raid, huge reprisals against Chinese civilians accused of helping the airmen. Thousands killed.
And elsewhere.
In Singapore, the Sukching massacre targeting the Chinese population right after the city fell. The Double 10th incident, also in Singapore, where many arrested civilians died under Kempeitai torture.
It's just atrocity after atrocity.
Mass deaths in custody in Java. Crushing riots like Tasikmalaya with extreme force. Executing local leaders like the Raja of Loang in Indonesia. The Calagon massacre in Burma. Hundreds of villagers killed as collective punishment for guerrilla activity. It's a horrifying pattern.
And we already mentioned their role with Unit 731, providing the Maruta.
Yes, the Chinese Kempeitai specifically feeding victims into that machine, subjecting them to vivisection, disease experiments. It's almost unthinkable. They also facilitated experiments on Allied POWs further south.
There was also that incident in Java with the contaminated vaccine.
Ah, yes. A tragic case where a vaccine produced locally caused deaths. And the Kempeitai arrested and executed the Indonesian director, Dr. Ahmad Mukhtar, essentially making him a scapegoat despite evidence he wasn't responsible. It showed their callousness and willingness to blame locals.
So, beyond these major atrocities, state-sanctioned violence, were they involved in more, say, criminal activities too? For their own gain?
Oh, definitely. They weren't just instruments of state terror, they were often corrupt. They set up extensive criminal networks.
Doing what?
Extortion was common. They basically ran protection rackets in occupied areas, making huge profits. And as mentioned, they were central to organizing and running the comfort women system, which was state-sponsored sexual slavery, but also involved coercion and trafficking.
And even propaganda like Tokyo Rose.
Yeah, that was linked to their efforts, too. Psychological warfare, trying to demoralize allied troops. So it's a mix. State repression, war crimes, organized crime, propaganda. A truly multifaceted and malevolent operation.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and look inside the organization. How was it actually structured? Who reported to whom?
Formally, they were part of the Army under the Administration Bureau. The top guy was the Provost Marshal General, and he reported directly to the Minister of War.
So, clear chain of command on paper.
On paper, yes, but accountability got blurry, especially during wartime. In peacetime Japan, technically, they answered to different ministries for different things. War Ministry for military stuff, Home Ministry for civilian police roles, Justice Ministry for legal administration.
Sounds complicated.
It was.
Yeah.
But in war zones out in the field, they were primarily under the local military commander.
Which could mean less oversight.
Potentially, yes. Less scrutiny from Tokyo, more direct control by the general on the spot, which could easily lead to abuses going unchecked.
Right, a recipe for trouble in occupied lands. What about the internal ranks? The hierarchy?
Pretty standard military structure.
Yeah.
Field officers Sakan, NCOs Kashikan, superior privates Jodohei, and regular privates attached as needed.
And how was it organized geographically?
They had HQs under each major army command, usually led by a major general or colonel. These HQs controlled field offices run by lieutenant colonels.
Okay.
And those field offices broke down into smaller sections led by captains or lieutenants, and even smaller detachments under second lieutenants or warrant officers. Plus, they had mobile field units, the Yasen Kempeitai, operating right near the front lines.
A complex structure reaching right down to the local level. And the auxiliaries, the recruited locals, where did they fit in?
They held limited rank, usually topping out at sergeant major. They weren't fully integrated into the command structure in the same way as Japanese personnel, but were used for specific tasks, local policing, guard duty, intelligence gathering, using local knowledge.
What about training? How did someone become Kempeitai?
Well, officers were usually graduates from the top military academies, serious military background.
Yeah.
Then, in peacetime at least, they got an extra year of specialized Kempeitai training law, investigation techniques, specific procedures. NCOs got about 6 months of similar tailored training.
So they invested in training them. It wasn't just random soldiers assigned the job.
No, there was a deliberate effort to professionalize the force, even if that professionalism included methods we find abhorrent today, like torture techniques.
And numbers. How big did they get by the end of the war?
At their peak, around 1945, estimates are about 35,000 personnel.
35,000. That includes everyone, Japanese and auxiliaries.
Yes, that's the total figure. Spread across Japan itself, Manchuria, Korea, Southeast Asia, it really shows the scale of their operations and their reliance on those diverse ethnic auxiliaries across the empire.
Let's talk about their look, the uniform, the equipment. What did a Kempeitai member look like? What did that appearance signify?
They usually wore the standard M1938 Army Field uniform, or sometimes the cavalry uniform. What often stood out were the high black leather boots became quite symbolic.
Right.
They could also wear civilian clothes on duty, but they'd have rank badges or the Imperial chrysanthemum symbol somewhere visible.
But in uniform, how could you spot them specifically?
The key identifier was the armband, a white armband worn on the left arm with 2 prominent black characters, Ken and Pei, meaning law soldier, and often a black chevron worn on the uniform itself.
That armband must have inspired fear.
Absolutely. It was an immediate sign of their authority, and given their reputation, it would have been deeply intimidating for most people encountering them.
What about weapons? What did they carry?
Officers typically had a cavalry saber and a pistol, standard officer kit.
Yeah.
Enlisted men usually had a pistol and a bayonet.
Okay.
And junior NCOs, interestingly, sometimes carried a shinai, a bamboo kendo sword.
A practice sword.
Often used for beatings, dealing with prisoners, inflicting pain without necessarily killing them immediately. It's another one of those grim details about their methods.
Grim indeed. Okay, so the war ends. Japan surrenders in 1945. What happens to the Kempeitai?
Officially, they were disbanded right after the surrender in August 45, part of the whole Allied effort to dismantle Japan's military machine.
So, told to just go home.
The orders were for personnel to disperse, return to civilian life, But of course, it wasn't that simple.
because of war crimes.
Exactly. Their actions during the war couldn't just be swept under the rug. Many Kempeitai commanders and ordinary members were rounded up by the Allies, put on trial.
And convicted.
Many were, yes, convicted of war crimes by Allied tribunals across Asia for the atrocities they'd committed. A necessary reckoning, though arguably incomplete given the scale of the crimes.
Is there any equivalent organization in Japan today? What's the lasting legacy?
Well, the post-war Japanese self-defense forces have their own military police called the Kimutai. But, and this is crucial, unlike the Kempeitai, the Kimutai has zero jurisdiction over civilians. That's a fundamental difference, reflecting Japan's post-war constitution and a deliberate move away from that kind of power.
And the legacy?
The Kempeitai remains this really stark symbol, doesn't it? A warning about unchecked military power, about how an organization set up for order can become an instrument of horrific oppression and brutality.
So, wrapping up our deep dive then, we've followed the Kempeitai from its start, a modernizing tool for conscription.
All the way through its massive expansion alongside Japanese militarism, becoming this pervasive force, both military police and feared secret police.
Operating everywhere from Japan itself to across its huge occupied empire.
And we've seen that dark duality. The initial aim might have been military order, but it descended into just systematic brutality, torture, massacres, leaving this terrible legacy of suffering.
Which brings us to a final thought, really, for you listening. How does this happen? How does an organization, maybe started with intentions of security or order, transform so drastically into an instrument of terror?
Yeah, what are the factors? Is it the ideology, the lack of oversight, the pressures of war, the individuals involved?
And what lessons can we take from the Kempeitai story today? About power, about authority, and maybe most importantly, about the absolute need for accountability when any group wields that kind of force.
It's a sobering piece of history, for sure, but one that definitely demands we keep reflecting on it, trying to understand it.